If you were standing in London in the year 60 AD, you wouldn't be admiring the architecture, and you certainly wouldn't be enjoying a cup of tea. You would be on fire, literally. The entire city of Londinium is currently a roaring inferno, burning so hot and so fiercely that it will leave a thick layer of red ash buried under the streets of London for the next 2,000 years. This isn't a minor skirmish or a polite disagreement over trade routes. This is absolute, unadulterated annihilation. The Ninth Legion, the pride of the Roman military machine, men who are supposed to be the finest soldiers on the face of the earth, are currently being wiped off the map. Now consider the absurdity of this moment. The Roman Empire is the superpower of the ancient world. They have conquered Greece, crushed Carthage, and turned the Mediterranean into their own private swimming pool. They have sophisticated logistics, heavy armor, and engineers who can build bridges over major rivers in a weekend just to show off. They are the irresistible force of civilization. And yet, here they are, huddled in their forts on this damp, miserable island at the edge of the known world, absolutely terrified. And who is it that has brought the mighty eagle of Rome to its knees? Who is the tactical genius commanding this army of nearly 250,000 screaming, blue-painted warriors? It isn't a Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants. It isn't a Spartacus leading a slave revolt. No, the person responsible for turning the Emperor Nero's hair grey is a middle-aged mother who has had a really, really bad week. The Romans, in their infinite arrogance and infinite wisdom, made a calculation error. They assumed that because she was a barbarian, and, heaven forbid, a woman, she would simply roll over and accept their rule. They thought they could humiliate her family and steal her land without consequence. They were wrong. They didn't just poke a bear, they poked a very angry, very intelligent woman with a chariot and nothing left to lose. Welcome to Epic British History. Today we march into the story of Rome's worst nightmare,
Charge
Boudicca.
forward! Destroy them!
To understand why the financial capital of Roman Britain is currently resembling a barbecue, we have to rewind the clock and travel north to the flat, marshy lands of East Anglia, home to the Iceni tribe. Now, the Iceni were not your typical unwashed barbarians, living in mud huts and throwing rocks at the moon. They were wealthy, they were proud, and they were led by a man named King Prasutagus. Prasutagus was what the Romans called a client king, which is a polite way of saying middle manager with a crown. He had struck a deal with Rome. He pays his taxes, he keeps the peace, and in exchange, Rome doesn't burn his house down. It was a comfortable arrangement, or so he thought. But Prasutagus had a problem. He didn't have a son. He only had 2 daughters and a very formidable wife, Boudicca. Worried about what would happen to his family after he died, Prasutagus came up with a plan that was legally sound, diplomatically clever, and utterly doomed to fail. He wrote a will, leaving half of his kingdom to his daughters, and the other half to the Emperor Nero. In his mind, this was a gift, to ensure the emperor would protect his family. Unfortunately, Prasutagus failed to account for one small detail: Nero. The Emperor Nero was a man known for many things: murdering his mother, kicking his pregnant wife to death, and forcing people to listen to his poetry. But sharing was not high on his list of hobbies. When Prasutagus died, the Roman officials didn't arrive with condolences and a fruit basket. They arrived with a ledger and a whip. The local procurator, a greedy bureaucrat named Catius Decianus, decided that half the kingdom sounded a bit too complicated, so he decided to just take everything. The Roman logic was simple. You are barbarians. You don't have rights. You have inventory. They seized the noblemen's estates. They treated the royal household like a looted shop. And then they made the single biggest mistake in the history of the Roman occupation. When Boudicca objected, presumably pointing out the legality of the will, the Romans didn't listen. Instead, they decided to teach her a lesson in humility. They publicly flogged the queen of the Iceni, and, in a display of cruelty that still shocks us 2,000 years later, they assaulted her young daughters. The Roman soldiers walked away from that atrocity laughing. They dusted off their hands, confident that they had broken the spirit of these wild Britons. They thought they had crushed a rebellion before it could even start. But what they had actually done was something far more dangerous. They had removed the only thing keeping the Iceni peaceful: hope. They stripped a mother of her dignity, her land, and her safety. And in doing so, they liberated her from the fear of death. The Romans went back to counting their stolen coins, completely unaware that behind them, in the dark forests of East Anglia, the drums were starting to beat. News travels fast, but rage travels faster. Boudicca didn't just rally her own people. She went on a recruitment drive that would make a modern marketing executive weep with envy. She turned to the neighbouring tribe, the Trinovantes, who had their own list of grievances involving Roman veterans stealing their farms and treating them like dirt. And she essentially said, "Anyone want to burn some stuff down?" The answer was a resounding yes. Suddenly, Boudicca wasn't just leading a tribe. She was at the head of a moving city. Ancient sources claim she commanded 230,000 people. Now, ancient historians are terrible at math. They usually just count the legs and multiply by a feeling. But even if we halve that number, it is still a terrifying amount of angry people with spears. Their first target was Camulodunum, known today as Colchester. At the time, this was the capital of Roman Britain, but more importantly, it was a retirement home for veteran soldiers. These were the men who had conquered the island, settling down to enjoy their pensions and complain about the weather. And because they were Romans, and therefore convinced of their own invincibility, they hadn't bothered to build any walls around the city. Walls are for people who are afraid, and Romans are never afraid. Well, until about 5 minutes after the horizon turned blue with painted warriors. The Britons descended on the city like a tidal wave. There was no siege, no tactical maneuvering, just a flood of vengeance. The retired soldiers, realizing too late that their reputation wasn't arrow-proof, retreated into the Temple of Claudius for a last stand. It lasted 2 days. Then, the roof came down. But wait, where was the Roman army? Where were the professional legions? Well, the nearest unit was the 9th Legion, led by Quintus Petilius Cerealis. He heard about the riot and thought, right, I'll just pop down there, slap them on the wrist, and be back in time for supper. He marched his column of heavy infantry straight into the relief effort without scouting. It was a disaster. The Britons ambushed him in the woods and slaughtered the entire infantry force. The 9th Legion, the hammer of Rome, effectively ceased to exist in an afternoon. Cerealis only survived because he galloped away on his horse, presumably leaving his dignity behind in the mud. Meanwhile, the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was on the other side of the country in Wales, busy destroying Druid groves. When he heard that the east coast was on fire, he force-marched his troops down Watling Street to reach London. He arrived, took one look at the panicked citizens, did a quick head count of his exhausted men, and then did the math. It was a cold, brutal calculus of war. He couldn't save London. If he stayed, his army would be swallowed whole. So Suetonius made the decision that no leader ever wants to make. He packed up his legions and left. He told the citizens of London, "You're on your own. Good luck." As the Roman standards disappeared down the road, the people of London must have heard the roar of Boudicca's army getting louder. The governor had chosen to sacrifice a city to save the province. London was abandoned to the fire. Suetonius Paulinus finally stopped running. He realized that he couldn't outrun the rebellion forever, and honestly, running is terrible for morale. He picked his spot carefully, a narrow gorge somewhere along Watling Street, likely in the West Midlands. It was a tactical masterclass. He had a dense forest protecting his rear, and steep slopes guarding his flanks. This meant the Britons couldn't use their sheer numbers to surround him. They would have to come at him head-on, funneling themselves into a tight meat grinder. Suetonius had about 10,000 men. Boudicca had, by conservative estimates, over 200,000. The odds weren't just bad, They were laughable. It was like 10 guys in a phone booth fighting a tsunami. On the British side, confidence was at an all-time high. In fact, it had crossed the line from confidence into dangerous arrogance. They were so certain of victory that they brought their wives, children, and grandparents along to watch the battle. They parked their wagons in a massive crescent shape behind their army, effectively turning the battlefield into a stadium. They were treating the destruction of the Roman army like a family picnic or a Sunday football match. It was a festival of hubris. Boudicca rode her chariot across the front lines, screaming for vengeance, and the noise from the British side was deafening. Chanting, drumming, and the clashing of weapons. It was designed to terrify. On the Roman side, silence. Absolute, disciplined, terrifying silence. Suetonius walked the line and gave a speech that was remarkably practical. He essentially said, "Ignore the noise. They are just shouting. You are professionals. Stick them with the pointy end." When the British horde finally charged, a disorganized ocean of humanity rushing into the narrow gorge, the Romans didn't flinch. They waited. They waited until they could see the whites of the Britons' eyes. And then, at the last possible second, snap. 2 volleys of heavy javelins, the pilum, soared into the air. These things were designed to punch through shields and armor like they were made of wet cardboard. The front line of the British charge simply evaporated. Before the Britons could recover from the shock, Suetonius ordered the advance. But not a chaotic charge. The Romans formed a wedge formation. Imagine a giant armored chainsaw made of men. They smashed into the disorganized British crowd. In the tight confines of the gorge, the Britons' numbers became a disadvantage. They were packed so tightly they couldn't swing their longswords. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a crush. The Britons panicked and turned to run. And this is where the family picnic idea became a fatal tragedy. They couldn't run. The wall of wagons they had parked behind them, the ones meant for the best view of the victory, now completely blocked their escape. They had walled themselves in. The Roman machine didn't stop. They pushed forward, pressing the trapped army against their own wagons. The slaughter was total. It is said that 80,000 Britons fell that day. The revolt, which had burned cities and terrified an emperor, ended not with a bang, but in a crush against a wooden cart. And what of the queen herself? What happened to the woman who made the empire tremble? Well, Boudicca was not the type to let herself be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. According to the historian Tacitus, she poisoned herself, choosing death over captivity. Dio Cassius claims she fell sick and died. Either way, the Romans never got their trophy. She slipped through their fingers one last time, denying them the satisfaction of a final humiliation. They gave her a lavish burial, or so the legend goes, but her grave has never been found. She simply vanished back into the British earth she fought for. But here is the great irony of this story. On paper, Boudicca lost. The rebellion was crushed. The tribes were subjugated, and Rome would rule Britain for another 350 years. But in reality, Rome blinked. The Emperor Nero was so spooked by the near collapse of the province that he seriously considered pulling the Roman army out of Britain entirely. They realized that these islanders weren't just simple farmers you could tax into starvation. If you pushed them too far, they wouldn't just write a letter of complaint. They would burn your civilization to the ground. Rome actually changed its policy. They fired the greedy officials who had started the whole mess. They started treating the Britons with a modicum of respect. Or at least, they stopped flogging queens in public. Boudicca's fire had seared a lesson into the Roman mind. You can conquer the land, but be very, very careful about trying to break the people. Today, if you dig down about 15 feet beneath the modern streets of London, past the sewers and the subway lines, you will find a thick, distinct layer of red, burnt clay and ash. Archaeologists call it the Boudicca destruction layer. The foundation of one of the world's greatest cities is literally the ashes of the Roman arrogance that she burned down. So, the next time you walk through London, remember, you are walking on the scorched earth of a mother's revenge. This has been the first chapter of epic British history. We have survived the fire, but there are plenty more battles, blunders, and bad haircuts to come. If you want to see how this island went from a Roman outpost to ruling the waves, smash that subscribe button like a chariot hitting a shield wall. I'm your narrator, and I will see you on the next battlefield.